Hello and welcome. My name's Tim Rycroft. I'm Chief Executive at AHDB, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to the Dairy Research Conference 2021, in which we'll be showcasing the results of a 5-year dairy research partnership between AHDB, the University of Nottingham, the RVC, and Harper Adams. We're excited to share the results of the programme because it was designed with industry input to address the key challenges affecting dairy farmers and their businesses. It's enabled robust, independent research needed to fill the gaps in knowledge around some of the key industry challenges, which include health and welfare, how fresh cow management can help eradicate lameness, and some new thinking around how diseases such as Johne's are spread. Feed efficiency, find out where savings can be made through using a new whole farm feed efficiency calculator. And consumer perceptions of dairy. What are the current consumer perceptions of the industry, and how can we help shoppers to make informed choices about balanced diets? Throughout the week, there's a packed agenda of sessions, including presentations, videos, and discussions, followed by an opportunity for questions with the researchers involved. And if a particular session takes your interest, make sure you keep an eye out for the road shows in 2022, where researchers will be presenting some of the practical aspects of their findings at dairy farms around the country, so you can come along to see how your farm could benefit. Thank you for joining, enjoy, and as always, please share your thoughts with us to make sure we can do the work you need to shape the future of the dairy industry.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We've got a jam-packed session lined up for you. Reputation of our industry is a priority here at AHDB. It's really important that we are proactive in meeting the emerging societal requirements for both the animal welfare and for the environment. However, we're not always very good at being proactive at telling the public about what we do in a way that they can easily understand. And some of our challenges in doing this is often the lack of robust evidence. So one of the things we have focused on at AHDB is to hear about the latest developments in building this evidence base so that we can better understand the public's view, but also providing them with the evidence and the facts that they need to understand our industry better. So with this, we have a lineup of AHDB staff and PhD students and researchers to talk you through some of the latest developments that have been researched over the last 5 years. But before we kick off, just a few small housekeeping issues. All of you at home are going to stay muted, and you can submit your questions through the ask a question box on the control panel. There'll be a little grey box that says questions, and you can just type your questions in there, and my colleague Jamie will facilitate the Q&A session at the end. We're going to finish at around 12:30, 12:35, and the presentations this morning will be recorded and they will be made available afterwards on our YouTube channel. There will also be a survey that will pop up at the end when the webinar closes down, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Susie Stannard. Susie works in our Consumer Insights team, and as the name of the team suggests, she focuses primarily on understanding what our consumers think about our industry. So over to you, Susie.
Thanks, Jenny. So I think I was asked to speak today to really give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of where consumers' heads are and what they're thinking about when they're thinking about the reputation of our industry. We know it's an absolutely vital area, and AHDB have invested quite heavily in understanding consumer reactions and consumer views on areas pertaining to the reputation across all of our sectors, and dairy is no exception. If you just click on one slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to understand is actually how some of these reputational factors that relate to farming and agriculture actually sit within some of the broader societal concerns that we have. And we did this study with an agency called Blue Marble, who help us to understand public trust in agriculture. And you can see here that actually some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, namely sustainability, so global warming and climate change, and also the humane treatment of farm animals, really fall into the top tier of public concerns that they have. In the boxes on the left-hand side, those are the most concerns that people have. And you can see those concerns have even displaced some of the bigger concerns that we've had in recent years. So we've been running this study since 2019. In 2019, it was all about Brexit was the #1 concern that the public had. In 2020, COVID-19 was very much the top concern, and that's still up there, but reducing. But actually what's really rising up the agenda is global warming and climate change, which is sitting on a par with plastic pollution and the humane treatment of farm animals, which is really kind of up there. So it's a big issue for consumers. Moving on one slide. So I'm just going to cover kind of our consumer landscape on these two areas, and if you just click on another one, what we can see is that when people are looking at products to buy, and this is a kind of across any food product, the welfare of animals is kind of really high up the rank order, as well as provenance in terms of what people say is really important to them. However, it's important to remember this is a bit of a do I want to go to heaven question. The answer will be, you know, do you support animal welfare? Do you look for that in a product? And the answer will be, of course I do. I'm not a sociopath, so therefore it's very extremely important to me. So we have a bit of a challenge here in that people believe that the welfare of animals is extremely important to them, and then if you click on one of the challenges that we then face is actually when people get to fixture and when they're looking at a meat product, and this is an example, a meat example, but it would be the same in dairy. Actually, when people get to the fixture and they're standing looking at what they would like to buy, the sorts of factors which really come in here are price. Is it tasty? Do I know how to cook it? What does it look like? And actually, the welfare standard that product has really sits quite far down the rank order, and there's also a difference between even there what people say is important to them kind of in principle, and then actually what they do when they get to the fixture. So there's just a distinction here between what people say is important to them and actually what is genuinely important to them when they get to a fixture and when they're presented with a kind of a price. Next slide, please. However, we also know that that some of these reputational issues, such as environment and animal welfare and health as well, also play a big role in terms of behaviour modification or reduction. So people who have given up meat and given up dairy and become vegan really will play back both health and the environment and animal welfare as a key reason for doing that. But it also plays a role in reduction. So for dairy reducers, which is the box in yellow, primarily the environment coming through, health as well, and animal welfare really playing a big role there. Next slide, please. And the other element which is really influential is negative news stories. So we know that where there are exposés, you know, things going on social media, etc., that can really play a big role in changing people's perceptions. So next slide, please. And what we really saw pre-COVID, we were seeing a lot of negative news in the papers. So whether that was about red meat, which is the line in red, or in dairy, which is the line underneath it, you always saw these negative news stories kind of building to a bit of a crescendo. And now some of those were around health, but some of them were around welfare and environment. And they really built to a bit of a crescendo up until pre-COVID, really. So the peak was really at kind of January, February 2020. Then what we saw with the advent of COVID-19 is that kind of dominated news coverage, and there was very little room for any other stories, certainly for a time. And because of that, some of that negativity that was coming through in the media was suppressed. And I think it's fair to say that the industry had a little bit of a reprieve, but the question is, how long will that reprieve last for? And if you click on one, we're already starting to see some kind of issues coming back into the media. Just click on a couple, because I think the build's gone a bit funny. But we know that sort of negative news does have an impact. So if we look at our sample within our audience, so people who have been exposed to any kind of negative media around meat, for example, are much more likely to say that they're eating less meat these days. And the same would be true for dairy as well, even though people still believe that meat's a vital part of a balanced diet. So it's really important to kind of manage some of those negative exposés in the media. Next slide, please. And yes, and as that COVID news has diminished, so those exposés have begun to receive more airtime again. And I think we're all familiar with those sorts of headlines, which are not good for any of us. Next slide, please. Just here, we just wanted to look at when consumers talk about welfare, what are some of the issues that they might see that they're particularly concerned by. And it's a little bit hard to read some of this writing. We carried out this study kind of across all animal agriculture, so there's some practices in there that aren't just related to dairy, but for dairy, you can see that some of the issues that kind of come through are kind of general issues around intensive or factory farming, is a perennial concern for consumers over on the right hand side, use of hormones and antibiotics, slaughter practices as well, particularly non-sun slaughter kind of comes through, and outdoor access is always something that consumers kind of relate to welfare, rightly or wrongly, but it is something that people play back. But some of the other issues that are coming through that seem to be resonating more with consumers at the moment is cow-calf separation, and more people are sort of worrying about that issue as an issue. And then also what happens to dairy bull calves as well, so a third of people are concerned around that, live exports coming through, and calf housing as well. And I think the interesting thing to note is that some of these issues are sort of gaining in salience over time. So I think it's true to say that people are hearing more and researching more about some of these kind of welfare issues. Next slide, please. And we do have challenges. So there is a clear consumer appetite for greater transparency. So within our study, we looked at how helpful they would find different ways of kind of generating transparency. So over half, almost half of people believed it would be very helpful to see labelling around how and where animals were reared, and a further 39% believe that would be somewhat helpful. So a lot of kind of appetite for that kind of thing. Also labelling around how much time animals spend outside. Sustainability labelling kind of coming through as well. And all of these things are very difficult things to kind of work out how we would do that. There's a number of challenges, and particularly around sustainability. So what does sustainability mean? There's a lot to be worked out there, but I think this data does show that there is clear consumer demand for that. QR codes coming through as well. And I think the interesting thing about QR codes is when we asked about QR codes a couple of years ago, it felt like a fairly niche thing that people will want to see. And actually, because of COVID, because people have got used to using QR codes to scan for menus or register their arrival at food service places, for example, people have got so much more used to using QR codes now. And therefore, that's probably a mechanism that we could use going forwards, particularly for younger age groups. So we do have this consumer appetite for greater transparency, but if you click on one, there's also a huge amount of misinformation and knowledge that's either absent or distorted. So as an example here, almost half of our sample agreed that they were concerned about the use of hormones in farm animals. And we know that people are concerned around issues around hormones and around antibiotics because they see reports from other markets. However, if you ask people, if you tell people actually UK farmers aren't permitted to use hormones in meat or dairy in production, only a third of people are actually aware of that. So there's a mismatch between, even though people are more interested in kind of what's going on, their knowledge is never 100% accurate. So there is a need to counter some of that misinformation. Next slide, please. However, we do have an opportunity in that there is a greater desire post-COVID to buy local and British meat and dairy, so that's grown. So more people now say since COVID, buying British or buying local has become more important to me. They also believe that purchasing local produce helps to support local farmers. If you click on one, please. And I think it's fair to say as well that those animal welfare standards are also likely to be a key battleground when defending against imported products in the future. So most people believe in the UK that British meat and dairy has higher animal welfare standards than meat from abroad, which is important because then that becomes a USP for British produce and it becomes a positive story to talk to consumers about. And we've looked at some data, so getting consumers to compare how they feel about British produce versus Australian and British produce versus produce from the USA. And you can see in the case of the USA in particular, British produce is felt to be far superior. A lot of that negative news about hormone raised beef and chlorinated chicken has really landed with consumers. However, for other markets that we're looking at having trade deals with, such as Australia, there has been less negative media and greater consumer openness. So it's really important that we can continue to have this USP with consumers, that in that they believe that British meat and dairy has higher standards. Next slide. So moving away from welfare, and I'm just going to go into sustainability. We know that we've had COP26 going on, and so that's really marked a resurgence of environmental concerns for consumers. All eyes are on the UK, and that is landing with people. So now the majority of people say they either often or sometimes consider the environmental impact of the food that they eat. Interestingly, the key considerations when they're thinking about that tend to be packaging, and plastics and environment really strongly go hand in hand for consumers. However, they are starting to think about issues around carbon footprint and greenhouse gases, which obviously then has an implication for dairy. Next slide, please. It's not all bad news for farming. When we ask people to think about which industries actually carry the most blame or have the most impact, people really tend to put heavy industry and factories at the top of the tree, followed by air travel, waste disposal, so again coming back to this plastics issue, and energy. And actually farming and food production sits lower down in people's rank order. However, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you're much more likely to put farming as your top concern, so it does have an impact. Next slide. Interestingly, there is some distinction between the opinions of farming locally versus globally. So if we just look at the first bar on the left-hand side, first of all, if we ask people generally, are they concerned about the effects of farming on the environment, the majority of people actually feel quite positive, and only a third of or quite negative rather. So a third of people are sort of agreeing that they're concerned. However, if we look at the UK specifically on the bar on the right, that picture flips, and actually people tend to be much more positive about produce from the UK and the effect that the UK farming has on the environment. Next slide, please. However, longer term, there is a growing scepticism about the environmental credentials of dairy farming. So back in 2015, when we started our tracking this measure, the vast majority of people felt in the UK that dairy farming is good for the countryside, about 67%. However, going through to the kind of our latest data, that's dropped down to about 42% now, and people are starting to believe that dairy cows do have a negative impact on climate change. So it's an issue that very much needs to be managed going forwards. Next slide. However, there are some concerns about the environmental impacts of importing foods from abroad. So again, as with welfare, there's a bit of an environmental USP. I think there is some understanding that actually producing meat and dairy in the UK can be better for the environment than importing it from, you know, markets from such as Brazil, where there's heavy deforestation, or even the environmental impact of the transport itself poses a concern for consumers, which gives us a bit of an inroad there. However, it's always worth bearing in mind that environment, as with welfare, sits lower down the rank order in what consumers decide to buy, and that factors such as price, taste and convenience always will win out. Next slide. And just finally, there is a real need that farmers need to demonstrate that they are part of the solution rather than just part of the problem, and that they are taking their environmental protection seriously. And we looked at a whole host of different methods that farming and the broader supply chain could use to show that they're taking the environmental responsibilities really seriously. Plastics came through, so people wanting to see non-plastic packaging on food, but the other things that could happen on farm, planting more trees and hedgerows coming through there was a real appetite to see that. People wanted to see food labelling, certifying sustainable farming methods, using more efficient farming methods, and using farming practices to help the soil absorb more carbon. Interestingly, looking at the commitment to net zero farming by 2040, which has been put across by the NFU, it's interesting for some, but particularly interesting amongst those who are most concerned about farming and the environment, which shows it's the right way to go. But if you click on one slide, one of the things that we found is that only a quarter of consumers, so 27%, are actually aware that British farming has that pledge and has that target to be carbon neutral by 2040. So even though we know it's the right thing to do, we've still got a job to do in terms of actually letting consumers know some of the actions that we are taking. Next slide, please. But we do have an opportunity. One of the things that we've done with this work is to look at trust and actually look where trust sits within the supply chain. So we've compared farming to the rest of the supply chain, so food processors, supermarkets, food service and government agencies. And interestingly, farmers are by far the most trusted group within the supply chain. And if you click on one, the reason behind that is because people really respect farmers for some of the values that they have. So they respect farmers for being experts in what they're doing, but also believe that farmers have a sense of care. So they care about their animals and they care about the planet. So we need to be able to demonstrate these shared values that farming and agriculture has, that is very much in step with broader societal values. Next slide, please. So if you just, the builds have gone a bit funny, so just click on, and I'll just kind of go through this just to summarise that there is a real opportunity for us in that COVID has re-sparked a love for meat and dairy and a bit of a love of cooking, and people really wanting to buy local and understand more about where their food comes from. However, with that openness comes a bit of vulnerability to negative messages as well as positive. It's really important that our industry safeguards our reputation in future. We have trust now, and we need to make sure that we retain that trust going forwards. So how can we do that? We need to demonstrate those environmental initiatives on farm and through the supply chain that we're taking. We need to make sure that any instances of bad practice in terms of welfare are eliminated or at least minimised. So that might be ensuring that all staff receive the proper training and support, whether that's on farm or actually when animals are being transported around. We need to look at all practices that we're doing with a consumer's eye. So think about what you're doing day to day, and would you be happy for if a consumer was standing there, would you be happy to do that in front of them? Or if not, why not? And should we be doing things differently? And we need to look for easier wins. We need to look for instances where weather science, which I'm sure Amy and Jake will be talking about, and consumer sentiment coincide. And I think that's me.
Thanks very much, Susie, and some great stuff in there. So we're going to move straight on to our next speaker, and we're going to have a Q&A session right at the end, and we'll have the panel of speakers on the screen so you can direct your questions to any of them or all of them. So next I'd like to introduce Amy Jackson. Amy's got a long-standing career in managing risks in terms of reputation to our industry, and about 3 years ago now, Amy embarked on a PhD with the University of Nottingham as part of our research partnership. And her PhD is focused primarily on understanding public perceptions of dairy farming. So Amy, I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you. So just to qualify, where I focus mainly is on perceptions of housing managing dairy cows, and there's a particular lean towards perceptions of welfare. So really good opportunity to build on what Susie was saying. If you just click on one, please. I just want to start with a story which I think is really helpful in making us think about how we see things from different perspectives. So this is from a paper by David Fraser and his colleagues from 1997, and it kicks off for a scientific paper in a brilliant way, talking about two dog owners who met one day to walk their dogs together. And one owner had grown up in a small family that valued health and safety and orderly, disciplined behaviour. And the dog of this owner had regular veterinary care, it had 2 meals a day of low-fat dog food, and was walked on a leash. Whereas the other owner had grown up in a large community that valued conviviality and sharing of resources and close contact with the natural world. This was the owner's third dog, because the other two had been run over. It had burrs in its coat, it was fed generously but sporadically, and had never worn a collar in its life. But each owner, judging quality of life from different viewpoints, felt sorry for the other's dog. And I think for me, that's what we need to think about a bit with dairy farming from others' perspectives. We have our views in dairy farming, but how do the public see us? Because to them, that's their reality. So if you move on a slide, please. So who prioritizes what in dairy farming? Some really good studies out there which kind of gravitate towards the fact that farmers look at regular care, good intentions, scientists look at biological parameters, outcomes, animal welfare charities, campaign groups want naturalness and maximal care despite the economic issues. And the public actually, they tend to focus on icons and symbolism of what they see as good welfare, things like space and straw and outdoor access. So for this reason, access to pasture is quite often seen as symbolic or a shortcut for good welfare. Move on a slide, please. But we set out at the start of this PhD to find out whether these views were universal. So we kicked off with a survey of 2,000 people. And what we did is we identified 17 attributes which were about how we could keep a cow or how milk could be produced. So 13 of them were about how we could keep the cow, and 4 of them were about the milk itself. So for example, things like had a low carbon footprint, was tasted really good, whereas the cow ones were about, you know, whether the cow got to be outside, whether she grazed, and whether she stayed with her calf, and so on. So these were 17 very short sentences. And how we presented this to people to get a ranking was we used this best worst scaling technique. So we gave people within this survey a short sentence about being in a grocery store, in the dairy aisle, and seeing these statements, irrespective of whether they were going to buy any milk or not, what was most and least important. So we presented these 17 attributes in 12 different sets of 5 in a different combination each time. And all we asked people to do was say what's most important and what's least important. And then the really cool thing about that is when you put it all into a model, it determines what is consistently ranked above, what is consistently ranked below, and so on. So if you move on a slide, when you put this all together, you get this ranking, which is a good way of doing things. And what we found here is that while we knew grazing would be important, we were quite surprised to see that it was equally important with health and welfare and comfort. So these were 3 equally important, no difference between them, to the survey respondents in this survey. Now, as you can see, other things were important, like fair price paid to farmers, was next. Cows having access to open yards. What Susie talks about cows having calves beside them was also quite important. Interestingly, just as a matter of interest, third from the bottom, low carbon footprint. Now, remember, this survey was done back in 2018, early 2018, so it was before a lot of this latest awareness on the environment had come about. But it does make me wonder whether people still compute what a carbon footprint on milk would mean versus the bigger concept of cows and the environment. Anyway, that's just an aside. So that gave us an overall ranking. But then what we thought was, well, is this representative of everybody in this group, or is there only diversity? Like, is it a combination of what they think adds up to this ranking? So we looked for groups underneath this, groups of people who ranked these attributes in a similar way, but as groups they were different from the next group, different from the next group. And if you click on the slide, we actually found there were 6 groups. And even more interestingly, when we looked back at the other characteristics that people had let us know about in the survey, such as socio-demographic information, ages, experiences, education, we found that these correlated quite strongly with some of these aspects, including people's values. So this showed us that actually grazing was only the most important out of this range to one of these groups. So it was roughly 15% of the survey group. But welfare and comfort, fair price to farmers, the taste of milk, like Susie said, taste is still really important, were equally important, as there was a group of people who had no preference, but they were still quite characteristic in that they were quite male, more male than the other groups, inexperienced with animals. So these groups all had different characteristics. And interestingly, the comfort group was where all the vegans and vegetarians sat in the group, and they had a very strong belief in the cow's mind. Whereas, for example, the grazing group tended to be more urban and older. Welfare group tended to be more universal in their values, and university educated. So that was really interesting. So what did that tell us? And the thing is that, moving on to the next slide, what does this mean? It told us there was diversity in the survey group, but it didn't actually tell us what preconceptions people had underneath these preferences, what they understood by the preferences, how people interpreted these short sentences, what they already know about the cow and the farmer, like what they're comparing that information against, what their understanding is about how we keep our cows, and then what this means for dairy farming given the current challenges that Susie's laid out. So we then went back to this group and identified 60 people within it who were really diverse, and we decided to do face-to-face interviews with them to find out more. And we used a couple of techniques to analyse the data. One was frame analysis, which I'll explain shortly, and another was thematic and linguistic analysis. So moving on a slide again. So frames are, just to explain what frames are, they're basically our data sets in our head, if you like. They're how we make sense of the world. So as we go through life, we receive information and we file it away. And then when we get new experiences, we compare that new information against what we already know. So we see the new information in that light. So it's quite important to understand how people currently see cows and farmers. And then that gives us a bit of an understanding about how they might see the questions that are asked and how they might process new information. So moving on again. So we look first of all at framing the cow, and the interviewees describe the cow using 3 frames. So the first one we pretty much expected is a sort of enduring animal, which stoic animal, put upon animal, used by humans, exploited or object of pity. So that was quite a strong frame. You could see a lot of people had that view in their heads. Equally, a lot of people saw her instead as a kind of force of nature, very elemental, connected with nature, to be respected, kind of knowing things that we don't. And then the third frame was about this sort of fellow traveller, this animal that goes through life the same as us and has some of the same experiences we do. And a lot of people saw 2 or more, all 3 of these frames at the same time. So they saw the cow in lots of different ways. We really didn't expect people to have this kind of connection with the cow. So that was a bit of a surprise. And even though they don't go around consciously thinking about it every day, they've got this in their heads. They've grown up with experiences of cows, even if it's just seeing through the car window. She's part of their heritage. She features in their personal experiences. And this is despite a lack of, one-on-one knowledge or deep contact. It's quite superficial, but it's quite meaningful to people. So move on the slide again. And actually what was interesting is during the pandemic, this story kind of cropped up in quite a few media outlets, and it was in the US and Netherlands and the UK. And this sort of idea of cow cuddling, and I think the idea had come about because people were lacking physical contact with other people, and they're people who were letting people come onto their farms to cuddle cows were actually talking about how this had really had a lot of interest, and talked about how they felt people were lacking that contact, and they sort of almost like that big physical presence of the cow. They felt a bit more like a child again with this big entity beside them, and they got a lot of sort of positive natural connection, mental well-being, just a positive kind of natural force, which I thought fitted in very well with this force of nature, that people kind of feel this contact with the cow gives them some sort of positive vibes, positive energy, and so on. A bit abstract, but this was definitely emerging during the pandemic. If you move on to the next slide. And then equally, one of my favorite quotes in the data was from one of the survey participants, one person I interviewed, who talked about how she drove to work, used to make her smile when she got up to work, drove along the A45 to Solihull, started at 7:30, and certain times of the year you'd be driving along, the cows are heading for milking, and they're literally walking in a line across the field. There's no one there. They know it's milking time, and it used to make me smile. Oh, you're off to work as well. And there was a lot of this sort of sentiment in the data of people seeing cows as having friends, like they had friends, and falling out with their friends and getting back together with their friends, about how they went to work, they had a job to do, they just took themselves off to work. So there was an awful lot of this kind of parallel lives feeling as well, which was that sort of fellow traveller, fellow cow frame. Next frame. Sorry, next slide. So how did they frame the farmer? Two ways: traditional or modernising. And that could have kind of probably been predicted, but what was unexpected was that people saw both of those in both positive and negative lights. And in a way, there was also a bit of a tension between what their personal experiences had been of farmers, or what they'd seen in sort of drama series or personal stories of farmers on TV, versus what they were sort of being told happens on modern dairy farms by some of the sort of campaign literature or even media stories, which weren't about a particular farmer, were kind of anonymized about this is what's happening in farming. So just to explain that a bit more, if you move on the slide. So the negative view of the traditional farmer, which I kind of didn't expect, because people tend to think about them in a positive light, is that traditional cuddly view of a nostalgic farmer. But people actually, some people did recognise, they talked about farmer running out of money, hasn't got enough food to supplement the cows, silage has gone belly up, and there's some distressing things that appear in the papers, farmers that can't cope. And this was seen as not as judgmental about farmers, but the fact that some farmers, they feel, are out of their depth because they're sort of stuck in the old ways and just can't cope in modern economic times. And I wondered whether there was a lot of reference to media stories about fair price paid to farmers, and I wonder sometimes whether that it generates a lot of sympathy, but I wonder if that also suggests that farmers can't cope and they're a bit out of their depth. So there might be a negative side to that story as well. Conversely, next slide, the modernising farmer, although people can see modern farming as a bit soulless, and that came through as well in a sort of negative way, there were also some very positive things about people who'd met farmers who had robotic milking systems or were using technology, and I thought they'd adapted really well, they diversified, and they were really, when they knew people or they'd seen case studies of physical people who'd done this sort of stuff, they were really positive about it. So it did say to me that actually the modern farmer can be presented in a positive light. Next slide. And then you get this conflict about what people see and then what they hear. So they go and they go to a farm or they go to a zoo, petting zoo, and they see cows in the field, but when they think about it, they're there to produce, they're tethered most of the time. When you see them in a news report, it's a negative vision. So there's that conflict between what they see and what they've experienced and what they know about the people involved in farming, and then these kind of news reports. And that's the difficulty, is these negative news reports or negative campaign literature and information which actually conflicts with what they think happens or what they've experienced, and that's a difficult one. Next one. So then I went on to look at systems, different systems, and how people viewed these different systems. And I don't know if you're aware, but quite a few years ago, Dairy Co, AHDB Dairy as it was then, did a study on farm costings and looking at 3 different systems. So there was a composite system, which is like a mixed system in the winter, out in the summer, then a fully housed system, fully grazed system. So we presented these to our interviewees in very simplistic terms. They're in the winter, they're out in the summer, they're in all the time, they're out all the time, as simple as that. So there were descriptions to go with each of these. Next slide. So we analysed this through thematic analysis. What do people say about this? So there were 2 themes that came out. The first was that they saw the cow as kind of a conflicted thing between domestic and wild. So they see her like us, and like having this need for domesticity and need to be cared for and managed, but she's also wild. So how do you look after both of those aspects? So in terms of these 3 systems, through that theme, the mixed system really accommodated that the best, because it met her needs. Outside all the time, although it was natural, they were worried that it lacked oversight, it lacked protection. What if there's a cow calving down the field? The farmer can't keep an eye on them all the time. She needs protecting because that's the duty of care. That's what our role is. But inside, she lacked the freedom and naturalness. So therefore, if you give her that mixed system where she's in when she needs to be, she's out as much as she can be, then that's optimal. So this dual vision of the cow being domestic and wild really promoted that kind of gravitating towards what a mixed system would be preferable for the cow. The other theme that came out was this confessed ignorance. They actually admitted they didn't know. When pressed, they really didn't know what was right for a cow. So how did they cope with that? They opted for the middle ground. They said mixed system, yeah, that's better because it's 6 of one and half a dozen the other. It's neither one nor the other. It's a halfway house. So that was one coping mechanism, which again favoured the mixed system. The familiar was their next coping strategy. So again, the mixed system was quite often what they recalled if they'd been on a farm when they were younger. They recalled from drama series on TV. They drove past them with the cows going out and being inside in the winter. But equally, there was some familiarity with a fully housed system where they recognised something from the media, something from campaign literature. Loads of people had not come across fully grazed systems. That was quite sort of unexpected to them, and they really struggled to process that. Or other coping strategies, they deferred to those who know better, which is farmers, supermarkets, government, assurance schemes, and the cow herself. Sorry, am I running out of time, Jenny? I'm going to rush on very quickly through these last couple of slides.
That's all right, finish. I'm just giving you a time.
No problem.
Nod.
Next slide. Next slide. So I'll just put these slides up. So this is a bit about them seeing the cow as wild, but also domestic. So they really struggle with this kind of like halfway house of what the cow is. Next slide. And then again, these coping strategies, 6 months in, 6 months out, the familiar aspect, the cow making her own choice, and also this kind of faith in the system that actually others know better what's right for the cow, so we'll trust in them. And those don't tend to favour one system over another. Next slide. Lastly, linguistic analysis is very cool because you put all this data, what people have said, through a programme, and it looks at what word patterns are saying, which give rise to certain sort of psychological things that are going on in their head, or how they feel about it. And what it found is with the mixed scenario, more logic, more positivity. They didn't have to think about it. It was more logical to them and most optimistic in terms of a better system. And that was either the housed or the grazed scenario. But in the housed one, most denial, least confidence, most negativity around it. With the grazed scenario, they thought it could be better. It should or would be the right thing. But there was a caveat around there about them being outside in the cold winter months. So, sorry, last bit, conclusions. Public are diverse, no one size fits all. We've got to remember that it's not all about one thing for them. They have an underappreciated cow bond, and we have this conflict about what farmers are actually doing between what they think they know and then what they hear from others. But modernising farmers can and are seen positively if we hear their stories. And lastly, mixed housing came out as optimal, positive. It made sense to them. housing year round, least popular, least understood, and they were quite negatively emotional about it. And grazing, although it's nice and natural, it lacks protection, it lacks oversight from the farmer, and it doesn't make sense to them, but it feels positive. And the cow is also quite a trusted expert. So if we then, next slide, last slide, take that on to where from here, we just say, can we engage better with the public? I think that's the question, or can we afford not to? But we could acknowledge or capitalise on this attachment to cows. We could promote the modern positive farmer. We could combine messages about our duty of care with naturalness. And we could promote the opportunity for cow-centric systems, which I think is a real positive. But also remember, it's a diverse group out there. It's not all about one thing. And that's it. Next slide. Just a thanks to Jenny, sorry I overran, and to my supervisors, Jasmine and Martin in particular, at Nottingham and AHDB for funding.
Thanks, Amy. Excellent. You fitted a lot there into a very short space of time. So we're going to move straight on to Jake. If you've just joined us, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So be popping your questions into the question box, and my colleague Jamie will collate them and ask them after Nick's talk. So I'd like to introduce Jake. Jake is a vet, and he's been undertaking a PhD, again, as part of our dairy research partnership with the University of Nottingham over the last few years. And this PhD came about because back in 2014-15, there was a lot of media coverage around housing cows, and particularly negative media coverage. And when we try to defend these types of news articles, often we hit a brick wall, and we don't often have the evidence base, the sound scientific evidence base to be able to defend some of our arguments. So this is one of the reasons why Jake's PhD came about. So today he's going to talk to you about the impact of living space on productivity, health and welfare. Over to you, Jake.
Brilliant, thanks Jenny. Hi everybody, as Jenny said, I'm going to be talking about my PhD that I've just finished this year, and essentially it's adding some scientific evidence to what we think we know about dairy cow housing. As we know from Amy's previous talk, it is a highly emotive topic for the general public, but I think it's also highly emotive within the industry as well, and for you as farmers. Globally, we know that most dairy cows will be housed, and this is usually for a minimum of 4 to 6 months a year, depending on the year. And even in the UK, the most stringent restrictions on time for housing is usually under supermarket regulations. For example, Waitrose here, even their organic dairy cows in 2019 were housed for 157 days on average, so still a high proportion of the year where these cows will be in house conditions. And I guess the most worrying thing about this whole topic is the current void in scientific background, which Jenny alluded to in the intro. We've got quite a bit on cubicles in terms of stocking densities of cows to cubicles, cubicle designs, lots of different designs. But in terms of the housing space, in terms of space allowances, ventilation, etc. Can we go back a slide? Sorry. We don't really know what cows want and need. And also to add into this ambiguity around what we should be doing, there's a lot of varied definitions, especially on terms like loafing spaces, where in a questionnaire that I've done with farmers, half the farmers would say that all their passageways counted as loafing spaces, and half the farmers said that none of their passageways would count as loafing spaces. So even within the industry, we can't decide what a loafing space actually is for a dairy cow. And then on top of this, we've got a lot of recommendations from people like Red Tractor, AHDB, RSPCA, the supermarkets, especially around space allowances, which are not based on any scientific evidence. So next slide, please. So to begin our research, we asked two questions. So the first was actually how much space do dairy cows actually have in Great Britain? And then the second one, how will the space actually affect dairy cows? And we looked at it in terms of reproduction, production, health, and behavior. And so on the next slide, I'll talk about how much space dairy cows do actually have. So this was from a random selection of 50 farms from across Great Britain. I didn't know anything about them other than an address before I turned up on farm, and I measured how much space their dairy cows had in cubicle accommodation and compared all those 50 farms. So what we can see here from this graph is that on the bottom axis is the total space per cow. So we've got a spread from 6 square meters, well, less than 6 square meters per cow to up towards 13 square meters per cow. So some dairy cows in Great Britain have double the amount of space than other dairy cows, and the average dairy cow has between 8 and 9 square meters of space. So huge variation there, probably because we don't really understand how that extra space affects them and why we would give extra space or why we would restrict space. If you want to find out any more about the ins and outs of this research, it was published in the Journal of Dairy Science under this title, Field Survey to Evaluate Space Allowances for Dairy Cows in Great Britain. And the next bit of what we did was looking at how we classify this excess space. So that's this living area per cow, and that's on the y-axis here. And we can see there's still quite a big variation that's linked in that, and it is quite correlated to how much space a cow has. But on the next slide, now I'll discuss why we went for living space. So this space to us is a good way of promoting that extra space to consumers. We are providing that extra space for cows to utilize, just like how when we're looking around a house, having a big living room is probably a good thing. So this is why we're sort of trying to promote this, but it also allows us to compare farms like for like. So this living space is just a term to use for space over and above a baseline minimum. So like this picture on the left-hand side of your screen, these cows have much wider passageways. They have a little indoor loafing area at the end. They can spread out more, and it allows us to compare that sort of indoor system to an outdoor system which just has what I would define as a specific loafing area. So this is a picture of the right, just a space outdoors that has no other function, no access to feed, no access to other parts of the housing. Cows are just going out here to express some kind of behavior that we don't really fully understand now. And then on the next slide, we have developed a calculator for farmers or vets or advisors to calculate living space easily for a herd based on a few simple parameters. So here we've got number of animals in a group, the total indoor and outdoor areas, a few bits of information about cubicles, so the width and the length of your average cubicle and the number of cubicles that those cows have had. If you put all this into this calculator, then it will provide you with how much space that your cows have, and it also compares you to those 50 randomly selected farms across Great Britain, so you can see where space sits at. And this is freely available through the Nottingham Herd Health Toolkit, along with a lot of other apps that you can use as well, so definitely worth checking out. So if we go on to the next slide, so it's all well and good being able to measure these things, but then what does it actually mean? What difference will this space make to dairy cows? So we set up an experiment where we compared the average space that was provided and the maximum space that was provided. So these cows on the left hand of your screen, these cows had about 9 square meters of space per cow, and that meant they had about 3 meter wide passageways, both feed and cubicle, and more restricted space overall throughout the shed, compared to the cows in the right hand side picture, which had a 3.5 square meter wide cubicle passageway and a 4.5 square meter wide feed passageway, plus an indoor loafing area, which you can see on the bottom right hand corner of the floor plan design there. And so just had generally more space in their environment. So they had 14 square meters per cow. If you click on to the next part, this will also show you that these cows had double the amount of living space when you use that living space calculator for these two areas. The other things that you can see from these pictures is these cows are in exactly the same environment, temperature, humidity, management facilities, feed face access, cubicle stocking densities, everything else was exactly the same between the two. And then on to the next slide, I'll just go through some of the ins and outs of this trial. So it was a year-long trial, randomized controlled trial, so as robust scientific trial as we could do. And we also tried to mimic commercial conditions. So the groups of cows were set up 35 cows to 39 cubicles in each group, and these cows were at varying days in milk, but they were matched on each side. So if we had a heifer at 60 days in milk in the control space group, we'd have a heifer 60 days in milk in the high space group, and they followed each other through. When one of those were either sick and had to be removed from the trial or had to be dried off, both cows would exit the trial and be replaced with a fresh cow pair, so a pair of cows less than 40 days in milk, and then we'd continue tracking those through until the end of a trial after 364 days. So we try to keep everything exactly the same, even up to the sort of group structure of the cows. That meant we had about 75 pairs of cows go through each side, and they were subjected to the same feed face length, same stocking density, even the same location and type of environmental enrichment as well. So if we go on to the next slide, we focused on these 5 subtopics for what we were analysing in terms of our results. So our main 2 that I'll be talking about today is the production and behavioural side, but we also looked at reproduction / fertility, which actually also came up with some important changes, but unfortunately I don't have time to touch upon those today. But we also did look at health and disease events and stress and immune function markers as well. Currently we're not talking about them either. So on to the next few slides. So first off, I'll be talking about the production of the 2 groups. So we modelled how much each group were yielding per lactation for the 2 groups. So we had 75 cows in each group, and this graph just shows their daily milk recording, daily milk yields. So we tracked all of these for every cow, and we put those into a couple of models to predict the average lactation curve for each group, which we can see on the next slide. So when we did this, we can compare the 305 lactation curve for each group. So the top 2 lines there, the red and the green, were our cows in the control group in the red, and the cows in the experimental group, so the high space group in the green. And what we can see between the multi-Paris cows is they're quite similar in terms of milk production, but this did equate to about another 100 litres in favour of the high space group per lactation. So we are still seeing a benefit there. Where we observed the biggest difference was within our heifers. So our heifers in our high space group actually produce another 600 litres per lactation than our heifers in the control space group. So massive difference here, having a huge effect on this subpopulation of animals. And to put this into context, these heifers were already giving sort of 12.5, 13,000 litres per lactation, and this is adding another 600 litres on top of that, just by changing the amount of space that they've got available to them. Within that, we did also look at rumination times, and we did see an increase in rumination time for the cows in the high space group as well. So some underlying physiological mechanisms coming through there as well. So on to the next slide, please. And the next bit I'm going to talk about is the behavior of cows. So this idea of the secret life of cows. So what we did was put a sensor on a subpopulation of these cows, and we monitored their XY coordinate in the housing, and then made up some daily time budgets so we could see how they were interacting with this space. And we used these sensors set up around the building to assess that. So we knew where these cows were within every 7 seconds whilst they were on trial. And on the next slide, we can see that where they were interacting with these space. So where the purple is indicating where they were spending less time, and up to the green and yellows is where they were spending more time. So this generally tended to be things like cubicle spaces, the robot, and the feed face, which will be your blue dots on that line. And then so we analyze this further on the next slide, that we can see how they were actually spending the 24 hours in their day. And our biggest result here that you can see in terms of the cubicle column is that the high space group, even though their cubicles and stocking density were exactly the same, were actually lying down for an extra hour per day. We didn't change nothing to the cubicles. This was just because of changes to the width of pasturage, and we were seeing an increase in an hour of lying time. Interestingly, this time was coming from them actually spending less time in the living space, of which they've got more of, but obviously this excess living space was allowing them to access the resources that they wanted to without being bullied or prevented for some other reason. So actually, by providing more living space, cows are using that space less, and actually putting that in favour of lying down longer, and also an extra 10 minutes of feeding time as well. So again, alongside the increase in production, some really nice outcomes from this study that we're being able to see. So next slide, please. And to summarise, we've got a large variation in space allowances, and now we're getting a bit more information about how these might be affecting our dairy cow, which is really important so that you as farmers can make informed choices when you're either designing a new shed or adapting a shed that you currently have, but also for our consumer perception of the industry. How are we trying to improve our housing? We've seen that behavioural changes, increasing lying time, which most people would agree is a more favourable thing for our cows to be doing. And it appears that milk volume production is also being increased as a consequence. There are some underlying reproductive performance changes actually in a negative way. So actually cows are taking longer to conceive in the high space group, but the underlying physiological reproductive measurements that we looked at didn't change between both groups. So this is still requires a lot more further investigation to look through more, which is part of our future research, which we would hope to look into and allow this to be generalizable to other systems. So cows that are housed for just 6 months a year, how would this space affect them when they're used to more space, for example? And we also need to start looking at the economic side of this as well. Putting concrete down for more space is a cost, but will this actually pay us back into over 20 years in terms of the increased production that we see? And also we need to start reporting things like the housing infrastructure specifications and other research, so we know that whether this might be confounding those results as well. If you've got any questions, can't wait to take them in the Q&A, but on the final slide, I'd just like to thank AHDB for funding my PhD, and also thank you to my supervisors, especially Martin, John, Chris and Jasmine, for helping me in my research.
Excellent, great, thanks. Thanks so much, Jake. It's wonderful. We're going to now move on to our last topic of the session, which is around the dairy calf strategy. As we heard from Susie earlier, about a third of consumers are concerned about the fate of bull calves on our dairy farms. So with that, a whole array of organisations have come together to create a national dairy calf strategy. And so we've got a trio of speakers. We've got Nick Parsons from AHDB, Phoebe Russell from NFU, and Emma Holden from Red Tractor to tell us more about the strategy.
Hi there, my name's Phoebe Russell and I'm Dairy Advisor for the National Farmers Union, representing and lobbying on behalf of dairy farmers across England and Wales. From an NFU perspective, I'm involved in leading on the GB dairy calf strategy, working alongside AHDB and other industry stakeholders across the supply chain to drive the strategy forwards. As an industry, we're committed to prioritising animal welfare. The strategy was introduced to ensure that all calves are reared with care and to eliminate the practice of routine euthanasia on farm. Whilst this practice was never and is not widespread or something any farmer ever wants to do, we understand that things need to change, and as the NFU, we really wanted to be at the table to support industry and our members in making the required changes to ensure the sustainability of the sector. This is in terms of ensuring high animal welfare, but also in terms of protecting the reputation of the sector. It's crucial for us all to continue to deliver high quality products to the public to enjoy in a transparent, safe and sustainable manner. And developing the calf strategy is a way for us to support our farmers and help industry transition to becoming ever more sustainable. It's never necessarily easy to make changes, especially at a farm level. For producers in certain systems, this may be more challenging, such as those shut down with TB, with block calving herds, or with smaller stature cattle, for example. So ensuring the right infrastructure, housing, management, labour requirements, these things all come at a cost and take time. Management and breeding decisions to be made, genetics, changes to breeding plans, this all takes time to adapt. And an element of the strategy, including the Red Chapter standard being implemented in November 21, should help farmers to enable to plan for these and enable them to put together a written breeding and management plan to manage calves on farm. The opportunities for industry are widespread though, and whilst not only protecting our industry, it also gives farmers the opportunity to reconsider and perhaps move forward with breeding plans, use of genetics or sex semen, potentially creating more value for themselves and others down the supply chain, making contacts and networks in their local and national areas. It also gives the opportunity to examine in focus young stock management, the use of colostrum, increasing health, efficiency, sustainability, and ultimately also profitability. Sex semen can have a really positive and impactful impact in making better breeding decisions, therefore it's integral to the success of this strategy. Sex semen essentially increases the likelihood of having a heifer calf, which we've seen a huge uplift in usage of sex semen recently in dairy as people have looked to change their breeding and management plans to comply with the Red Chapter standard. This means farmers are really thinking carefully about what offspring they're producing, how they fit into the herd, or how they fit various markets. Some supply chains might even suggest or request the use of sex semen as a positive way of focusing breeding, otherwise it could be a commercial choice. The GB dairy calf strategy is the first of its kind and offers overall industry management of risk, protecting our reputation, so this is positive for farmers and NFU members. And on an individual farm basis, it enables them to showcase their strong sustainability credentials, improve the progressive and focused approach to their business and dedication to feeding the nation. The strategy offers the support, guidance and knowledge through dedicated resources, for example an online Q&A, webinars and industry contacts. In some cases we're working to influence policy, for example in relation to the TB workstream led by the NFU, which aims to increase biosecure routes to market for TB restricted herds and minimise TB frustrations on farm. The two working groups, one farm focused and other outward looking to market opportunities, allows links to be made and opportunities for dairy beef to be capitalised upon, whilst ensuring viable, healthy, profitable calves are produced on farm to go into these markets. NFU members, through this strategy, can grow value for themselves as dairy farmers, but also beef rearers and the wider supply chain by producing more economically valuable calves and building on our already high health standards, enabling them to be more agile and ready for the next challenges, ultimately becoming ever more sustainable. I think the strategy really highlights the commitment of industry to collaborate and come together to drive forward positive initiatives to have a meaningful difference. So it really tells the public that we care, that we won't bury our heads in the sand on things we know we can do better, and will galvanise one another to make positive changes, upholding the highest standards of animal welfare. We're transparent and open to new ways of working to be the best we can be in our pursuit to produce high quality dairy and beef products with high sustainability credentials for our great British public.
I'm Nick Parsons, I'm Head of Dairy Development for AHDB, and in this guise also for the working groups of the GB Dairy Calf Strategy, I'm chairing two of the working groups.
So Nick, can you tell us what the target all calves are to be reared with care means and how this can be implemented?
Yeah, so the target of all calves reared with care is a priority because of the dairy industry risk to our reputation. Consumers want to know we care and not just farm. Its impact on our farmers' market is the risk of diminishing long-term the support we have with the majority of consumers for our Great British Painter and the wider dairy products.
And can you tell us why the priorities encourage responsible breeding strategies through farm assurance was introduced and the impact that this might have on farmers?
Yeah, so the target of the priority to encourage responsible breeding strategies through farm assurance. This is to link the thinking of dairy farmers to that of their colleagues in the beef industry, both the rearers and the finishers. Producing calves that are valued and will go on to produce a profit is crucial to a long-term secure supply chain. This includes thinking about whether the cow is heavy enough to support the beef breed. I refer to the weight and the stature of the smaller cow. Are they helping to produce a saleable calf? If not, can we breed in 40 or 50 kilos more into that future generation to move the job forwards?
What about people that are in high risk TB areas?
Yeah, so high TB risk area or even shut down with TB. The beef industry is clearly saying the right continental beef breed onto those cows not for producing a replacement heifer calf will create a saleable calf. The wrong native breed will risk no market, therefore begs the question, is it really a responsible breeding policy that they're carrying out?
And can you tell us why the priority better communication of market requirements and opening up of new pathways and supply chains for dairy bred calves was introduced? And what does it mean for farmers?
Yeah, so better communication of market requirements and opening up of those new pathways and supply chains for dairy bred calves is needed because our farmers in the supply chain, we need to explain the needs of the customer. In this case, the rearer and the beef finisher. As with the smaller stature cows, using the right beef breed can help and will help to get the right product for those beef breeds.
So how crucial is it to match beef calves with the market? And what are AHDB doing and the industry groups doing to take this forward?
Yeah, so helping farmers match up their beef calves with the market and the integrated supply chains is crucial. As an industry support group, we aim to create a one-stop shop for information to help farmers, to inform farmers and connect them with their ideal marketplace.
Can you tell us about how the dairy calf strategy is supporting the British beef sector and how we're going to promote our product?
Yeah, so supporting the British beef sector is important. AHDB have been working on ensuring the new market opportunities for dairy beef understand the top British quality of the dairy beef cross. It's farm assured and coming with a far lower carbon footprint than most imported beef product. All strong selling points for British produced dairy cross beef.
And who are we engaging with on this subject?
Yeah, so we're talking to retail, we're talking to food service, both the top end and mass catering, along with the opportunity to try to displace imports with high quality, low environmental impact dairy cross beef products into the likes of government procurement places.
Hello, I'm Gemma Holden, Red Tractor's Dairy Technical Manager. As part of the industry dairy calf strategy, Red Tractor consulted on a proposed standard to help ensure the industry delivered its commitment to rate all calves with care and eliminate routine euthanasia of calves by 2023. The new standard focuses on a documented breeding and management policy, and Red Tractor already have standards for the care of young stock regardless of their gender. So taking the breeding point of the policy first, we're asking for that to document the semen usage, whether that be sexed or not, calving pattern and the heifer replacement rate. In terms of management, we're asking for the provision of rearing facilities to cover the number of young stock, which is providing the calving pattern provision for 100% of expected births over a 10-day period. We're also asking for it to cover the identified market for the breed of calf produced. So we're not saying it all has to go to one market, we're saying it could go to several markets, whether that go through an auction, go to a rearer, or some calves retained on farm. And then we're also asking for an emergency plan for TB breakdown. So we're not asking for facilities to always be set up, but the known number of pens and hutches spaces is available. So for the small number of members this affects, there are some challenges, including smaller stature cows and spring calvers. Therefore, some of the longer term breeding decisions may be to look at the size of cow which is being bred on the farm, and what kind of calf that this will produce and what kind of calf that the market requires. For TB, it's accepted across the industry that TB could potentially be a problem, with increased number of animals being kept on the farm. It's important that the industry continues to communicate so that its informed decisions can be made. So derogations may be possible for this standard, but it's important that Red Tractor is informed of any decisions before the decisions are carried out. Hopefully this can be seen as a step forward to lead the industry and out of a reputational risk.
Okay, that was the link there on the screen to be able to find out more about the strategy. It's available in a download. And I guess the other important thing to highlight, it is widely supported by over 40 industry organisations, retailers, across our industry. Okay, so we're running a little bit over time, but that doesn't matter because we're still going to have our 15 minutes for Q&A. So my colleague Jamie is going to facilitate the Q&A session. There she is. So if our panelists can all pop on their videos and turn their microphones back on. Excellent. Our audience at home can see us all now. And Jamie, over to you for the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've had some great questions come in actually. So Susie, we'll come to you first if that's okay. One person is asking, are the consumer demands abroad similar to British consumer demands, or are there different things that people who would be buying from our export products require?
That's a great question, and it is an area that we've been doing quite a bit of work on, particularly on understanding some of the further afield markets. Obviously, we've got some challenges on the EU markets. We're now looking further afield. So we've done a number of kind of export focused research studies looking at what consumers are looking for in Asia, for example, and in some of the North American markets as well. And it really does vary by market. We know, for example, in China, consumers very much focused on food safety above all else. I've had so many kind of they had the baby milk scandal, where sadly a number of babies actually died. So they're very much focused on food safety above all else. Quality, purity, those sorts of metrics, as opposed to perhaps some of the welfare and environment sitting a bit lower, kind of down the rank order. However, welfare and sustainability can be a signifier of quality. So it's all about how we kind of package up some of those messages. For some of the different markets like the US, they're probably more aligned with the UK in terms of what their consumers are looking for. Welfare being quite important, as well as sustainability.
Thank you. So there's another one here. I think Susie and Amy, you might both want to comment on this one. When milk processors take milk from multiple farms with mixed production systems, how can we better tell our story without the processors ending up prescribing exact protocols for everything, and therefore perhaps removing the choice of the cow? Susie.
Another good question. I think that's a tricky one, and it depends how precise you want to get about kind of on farm stories. And I've seen different examples of it being done. So, for example, I think Arla somewhere in the Nordics was looking at a traceability scheme which looked right the way back, so you could trace your particular milk all the way back, and the journey it had taken all the way back to the farm, from the delivery man who picked it up, what the temperature was at the time. And it was a wonderful kind of resource to actually really share the journey of that milk with consumers. However, that was for quite a premium line. So, for more kind of ordinary milk, then it's more of a challenge, and so those stories will need to be more generalised. But there's still some wonderful, more generalised stories that can be told that are pretty prevalent across all production systems.
I think it's, I mean, look, I've been involved in the dairy industry for years, and I've communicated around fully housed systems and communicated about, you know, health and welfare. It's largely based on the management. It's not about the system, it's about the management. And I think we all know that within farming. But the problem is, and what I've realised through these 3 or 4 years, is that perception's reality. And we can communicate all the health and welfare we want, but actually that's not what chimes with the public. They look at these icons of pasture and they relate to that, and they associate with that. And what worries me particularly is that with this sort of proliferation of dairy alternatives now, I think we really need to think about how we make people feel good about their food choices and feel good, and we can help them to feel good. And I think we really need to start thinking about whether milk, we can promote these mixed systems more, and really communicate to people about the farmer stories, about the modernising farmers, about the mixed systems. How you get around level production, how you get around house systems, I don't know, but that's the problem we're up against.
Linked to that, someone is also asking, do you both believe that consumers understand fully the environmental picture behind dairy alternatives?
No, probably not, because it's a really complex area, and it's an area as well where there isn't very much data, and certainly there's not very much unbiased data, shall we say. So I think it is a challenge for consumers to kind of pull apart what's what. However, there are signs that you know, there's some level of discrimination going on with consumers. So, for example, we know that they're choosing almond milk less than they were previously because of some of the negative news around water usage in you know, drought hit areas. And actually, what we've seen is quite a big movement across to oat milk, where it probably has a stronger sustainability claim for some of those reasons. So there is some awareness going on, but not, you know, it's not a full picture, and I think we need more data on some of that.
And from my perspective, I mean, obviously, I gathered a lot of data. Even the interviews I did, when I asked them about environment, and really very few people brought up the environmental impact of dairy cows. But this was again before this latest kind of peak of activity. But I mean, I think one thing I would say from my own crisis and issues management background, I mean, we've seen this situation with antibiotics, is we get most traction with the public when we take ownership of our share of the responsibility and just don't completely deny all the time. Now, it's a very polarized issue. We could argue about who caused it, who's contributing to it now, who's got most to do. But I think what we need to do is probably change our narrative a little bit to walk away from whose fault it is and actually talk about what we can do. And what we do know is, because methane's a relatively short-lived gas, if we can talk more about how little changes we can make to reduce actually is going to have a big impact, and we can talk about it more positively as being part of the solution. So I think at the moment, trying to allocate the blame one way or another is not productive. But if we can show what we're doing and be proud of that and contribute to climate cooling as a result, then I think that's the way forward.
I think there's also a really strong story to tell about affordability and the place that dairy milk has within as a really affordable source of protein and other vitamins and minerals, which are hard to get from other places, particularly as, you know, there are some real consumer challenges which are coming down the line in terms of, you know, economic situation. And, you know, a pint of cow's milk is a lot cheaper than some of the alternatives, and it's also, you know, so it opens up nutrition to more people, I think, than if you were expecting people to start having alternatives en masse. You know, that we really need to kind of hammer home that message, because it's really important.
And it's it's a natural whole food. It's not emulsified, processed and everything other than the basic sort of pasteurization. It is a whole natural food, which I think is a massive advantage if we can sort of play on that. But that's not, I mean, that's more Susie's area than mine. But I certainly felt that coming through, is there's this connection with the naturalness of cows.
Lovely. We've got lots of questions for Jake and Nick as well, so we'll just round things off here, Amy, with how do you think the dairy industry should now act as a result of what you've learned from consumers?
I think it's citizens as well, because consumers are people who actually consume dairy products. We're actually talking about also what we call social license to produce, because there's a lot of people out there who might not consume dairy but can affect our ability to carry on what we do. So I think it's a bit of what I said before, is I think we need to start thinking commercially, competitively about how we make people feel good about their decisions. I think we can promote farmers and really bring forward, you know, the technical aptitude, what people are doing to improve the welfare of cows, duty of care to cows, modernising in a really positive way for cow welfare. I think we can talk about the individuals and bring it to life through the individuals. I think we can talk about the systems that people are going to feel good about. But we need to really look at what people is grinding away and gritty in the back of people's minds that they're feeling really uncomfortable with, like the bull calves, like housing year round, and really look at how we can make them feel good, not just put up with it, but they don't really want to, but feel good about their choices.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Jake, we'll come to you next then. We've had lots of people offering their congratulations on how interesting your research is and how important it is to them and their businesses. So that's fab feedback. One question, how important is cow flow to influence how they use their living and loafing areas? So for instance, is a narrow gateway to an outdoor loafing area a barrier?
Yeah, I think that sort of hits the nail on the head with why we were seeing those changes in behaviour. It's all about cow flow so that they can access those resources, but I don't think we currently know what would be a minimum or the optimum amount of space for them to be able to flow directly through that. And it will also change by system as well. These cows were on a robotic milking system, so actually things like the feed face and cubicles, they probably weren't as in demand as a 3x milking system where cows would be standing waiting to be milked for a longer duration of time, so impacted on their time budgets. So actually this was the differences in behavior in this research actually shows that, yeah, we could be even limiting cows further through other management practices, like, yeah, narrow crossover passageways as well, for example, between feed to cubicles, because we know that's a natural flow of be milked, eat, go to a cubicle. Well, if your crossovers are narrowed because you've got a water trough in there and you've got a dominant cow stood drinking for 5 minutes, well, that is going to impact on the flow of the rest of your herd. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that needs to be looked into as well.
And did you see differences in mobility between a relationship in mobility then, locomotion score?
So our mobility scoring, so we mobility scored the cows twice a week, because it was more of we need to make sure that these cows were in high health, because it was under Home Office license. So any cow that was sick or had, for example, a score 3 mobility would have to have been removed off trial. So we were more focused on prevention generally across the two groups rather than looking at that as a specific outcome measure. In terms of just the raw data, there wasn't an observed difference between prevalence or incidence of becoming a score 2 or 3 cow between the two groups, but this is also on a very small sample size of animals, so that sort of trial would have to be looked at over many hundreds, if not thousands of cows over different systems to account for that variation. So we can't really come up with set conclusions around things like mastitis, lameness from this single research trial, which is why we need more funding and more work into it. So if anybody has a pot of money, then that'd be great.
We have got several people have been asking about return on investment. So there's the link that you've shown to yields in terms of increasing space increases yields, but would there be an increase in profitability? I suspect you may not know the answer, but we'd love your comment anyway.
Yeah, so we have done a bit of work using simulation modeling on different farm systems, for example, of how the results from this trial might play out in the real world, depending on when age of when cows are being culled, depending on the system. Generally, those results are looking like it would either be cost neutral for providing extra space in terms of the pure economics. If not, it would be it would pay back, as in you would profit from providing that extra space. But that's just using the results from this single trial. So for these cows in this specific conditions, we would be pretty convinced that over a 20-year period of investment, we would get payback from this. However, there's a lot of caveats to that. And again, it's something that needs to be looked into and is important. But on top of that, purely financial, even if it is cost neutral, or I think we also have to look at the behavioural effects that this is having on cows as well, which we can't even put a cost to per se. So there are other costs that we can't give a specific pounds or pence to, that we should be accounting for in our interpretation of these results as well.
Okay. And one final question, did you look at loose housing at all as part of your studies?
No, so this was specifically on cubicle housing. We did collect a bit of information on loose housing, but that was generally hospital pens and whatnot in the first trial. And there were 3 farms that were housing purely on straw yards, which were omitted from the final results of that 50 farm initial study. But yeah, there is more information out there. There is a bit more research in terms of space per cow in those systems, in terms of disease prevention, for example, mastitis. So there's a little bit of science out there, but again, it's another area that desperately needs some more work to look at it.
Okay, Nick, I've got a point of clarification for you. Could you please explain what is a small stature cow?
Okay, yeah, that's so I think we sit and the discussion has been around this for some time, and the challenge comes back from those herds who have specifically block calving type cows, New Zealand type cows, as to what we're talking about. And I think what we're not talking about is those British Friesian type cross cows or small Holstein cows. What we're talking about is where farmers have gone down a specific crossbreeding route. And if you want a figure, I managed to glean a figure out of some of the business people I was talking to within the strategy and the working groups. So we believe, and where we start to draw the lines based around needing to add weight to these cows, and bearing in mind that what we're talking about is over generational kind of breeding, is that looking to put 30 to 50 kilos back into these animals is around this kind of 470 mark as a cutoff. So 470 kilos, below that, and we really do start to influence, irrespective of what we're putting as a crossbreed of bull onto that cow to try and create the progeny. And what we're talking about is the progeny here, not just the cow itself. And I know, and we've got block calving people who sit within the working group of the strategy as well, and we've had a debate about this, but we reckon at that point, somewhere around that point, we start to really influence the viability of those the progeny to go into a beef system, and that's coming from the beef integrators clearly highlighting that we really start to challenge their ability, the beef industry's ability to create viable stock, viable beef animals through those systems.
Thanks very much. So I've got one question I'd like to offer to you all to comment on then, please. How can food labelling be used better to protect the reputation of dairy? So Susie, we'll come to you first.
It's a bit of a complex area, food labelling, but I know DEFRA put a call for evidence out for creating a potential welfare labelling at the moment. So it's something that we've been thinking quite a bit about. What we would urge anyone to do is to look at welfare outcomes rather than system of production, so that consumers get the most honest view of what real animal welfare is and what the best outcomes are for any animal involved.
Amy.
Yeah, I so agree with this. I mean, I think the danger is that I'm afraid the campaign groups do this, is they try and conflate welfare with system, and that's just so wrong on so many fronts. It's misleading, it's disingenuous, and I think, you know, what we have to really push hard is to say, look, you know, if we have a welfare labelling, it's got to be about welfare outcomes. If people want to buy produce from animals reared a certain way, then by all means, you know, go down that route, but don't try and say that access to pasture is going to improve welfare, because that's just short sells so much that farmers do on a daily basis in all systems to have good welfare. And it also, you know, also potentially allows you know, poor welfare to sit there under the guise of a system and go unnoticed. So I think we must separate out the two, and we must, I know there's consultations going on with DEFRA. I know they've done a call for evidence at the moment, but I'm no doubt they'll be doing a consultation on labelling. I think it's really, really important the farming community's heard on this, but don't undersell the appeal. If people want to buy a product that has been reared in a certain way, then, you know, on grass, for example, then great, but make sure it's not pretending to be high welfare.
I think I'd just say it's we're trying to highly simplify something that is very complicated, and that always takes out the variation, which is the consumers are varied. So if we're just talking about one sign or one slogan or one thing on a bit of packaging, you could risk also alienating a decent proportion of people that are consuming that product, because they're like, oh, why are they putting this, or why has this brand put this on theirs and not the other, when they could both be doing the same thing. And yeah, it's highly complicated area, and it just shows from Amy's work and Susie's research, you know, there's no one standard, one size fits all approach, and we can't just keep simplifying things to try something when it's highly complicated, would be my 2 pence on the question.
I think just to add my final points in with regards to, I think I would have touched earlier on the fact that the dairy roadmap has been working for a long while and has been reinvigorated to pick in the sustainability and the environmental credentials of dairy right the way through the supply chain, rather than maybe just the processing level as it was. So I think that's going to play its part with regards to trying to help consumers understand and move out to a consumer kind of awareness of what dairy is doing and how we can compare to others and how we can improve. And I think we all recognise that there's room for improvement with regards to the environmental credentials of dairy, and we can do that through the work that we're doing with regard to understanding some baselines, so we know where we are, and then to move forward and for farmers to adopt best practice and to move forward with that. How we can then convey that across to the consumer, I think, is important. I don't think, as Amy said earlier, that we need to be comparing ourselves necessarily to the alternatives, whether they be dairy alternatives or other alternative drinks and products. But I think what we do need to do is make sure that our house is in order as British dairy industry, and that we promote that and show how well we do and how suited we are as a climate to producing dairy products in this country. So I think that's the positive piece that the dairy industry should take forward, is that we do produce very effectively and efficiently, and with the Retractor brand across the top as assurance standards, then that also should give a consistency of message across to consumers.
Thanks very much. I think that's all we've got time for questions.
Excellent, great job. Thanks very much, Jamie, and to the panel. So I've got the great job of summarising all these wonderful presentations we've just listened to. And I think, you know, Susie did a great job at sharing with us the concerns of our consumer, but also how those concerns are changing over time. And the one thing that really stood out for me is that our consumers want greater transparency. There is a desire, there is a want from them for us to be able to be more transparent and to communicate in a language that they can understand. But COVID has had a positive impact in the sense that there's a desire to buy local and to support local. So there's a real opportunity for us here to tell our story in a much easier way that will promote even more consumers to buy and support local. Then we move on to Amy, and well, I think we already knew from Susie's presentation that our British public are not all the same. They are very diverse, and in fact, according to Amy's PhD, there's 6 distinct groups of British public, and they all prioritize different they all have different priorities when it comes to dairy farming. Some of them it's welfare, some of them it's a taste of milk, and for some of them it's given a fair price to the farmer. But one surprising result from Amy's work is how people really connected to our cows. They seem to feel this real deep sense of connection to her. And again, there's an opportunity for us there to tell the British public more about her story and her day-to-day life in a way that they can relate to. And I found the cow cuddling quite amusing. Maybe this could be the next trend in diversification on dairy farms, who knows. I would like to also just highlight that Amy's work's been published, and you can find the published work on the Journal of Dairy Science. Alternatively, you can find a report on the research pages of the AHDB website, and I'm sure we'll send out a link to those pages when we're sending out more information. So then we move on to Jake's, and Jake's research has been well received by the farmer audiences today, given by some of the comments and questions that have come in, which is wonderful. And I think it's important to highlight that 99% of our cows are housed at some point throughout the year. So we shouldn't be pitching fully housed system versus grazing systems, because when it comes to housing, majority of our cows are housed at some point. And from the cow's perspective, does it matter whether that's 365 days a year or whether that's 5 months or 4 weeks? And this is sort of what Jake has tried to tackle, is when it comes to that housing environment, what's important to the cow and how much space does she value? And does that really make a difference on her productivity, on her health, on her welfare, and on her fertility? And one of the staggering results from Jake's work is that when he looked at the heifers that had the most space, so this was 14 square meters, they produced an extra 600 litres of milk on top of their already 12,000 litres. So I think this does demonstrate the importance of having space for cows when they're housed, regardless of the length of time that they are being housed for. And then we heard from Susie that a third of our consumers are concerned about bull calves and the fate of our bull calves. And we heard from NFU, Red Tractor and AHDB about the national strategy, and in particular what farmers can do to be able to align with that strategy and to meet the Red Tractor standards that have been recently incorporated into the Red Tractor Dairy Assurance Scheme. So with all of this information, we've got huge opportunity to better communicate with our British consumer, and to bring these evidence and this science out to them in a way that they can understand, and hopefully also to help you farmers and all of the rest of you vets and advisors working with the public or in conversation with the public, to be able to bring across these latest facts and figures and have a more meaningful evidence-based conversation with those that are interested in our industry. So with that, I will close the session for today. We were supposed to end on one last video by PhD researcher Laura Shewbridge Carter, but we've had some last minute technical issues with this presentation, so we're not going to be able to showcase that just now, but we will send out a link to it to all of you, and it will be up on the Dairy YouTube channel once we iron out those technical challenges we've had, unfortunately, this morning. I would like to thank all of you for listening in and taking the time to listen to our speakers. I'd like to thank our panel of speakers who did an excellent job. All of these presentations will be available to watch back on the YouTube channel, so please do sit down, listen to them again, or share them with your farm team who might be interested. And I will close the session for today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Jenny.